Hi, my name's Stewart Lynch, and in this video I'm going to introduce you to disclosure groups in SwiftUI. I'll start with a basic example and show you how you can stylize them, and also show you how you can programmatically control the expansion and the collapse of a group. We will complete the video with a practical example where we convert a boring list view of items to a grouped list using disclosure groups that will allow us to collapse and expand the data. I love getting your feedback, so tap the thumbs up button if you enjoyed this video and leave a comment below. Make sure you subscribe to the video and ring that bell to get notifications of new videos. And if you want to support my work, you can buy me a coffee. There is a starter application for this project, and I encourage you to download the project from the link provided in the description and work along with me. The starter project can serve then as a reference for you in the future if you decide that you want to implement disclosure groups. As with all of my starter projects now, I add some custom assets. I have a custom accent color and a custom launch screen and icon, so that the app will be easily recognizable on your simulator or on your device home screen if you install it there. The starter project is actually for the second part of this video, but we can use this project here for the introduction by creating a new view that we can manipulate in the preview canvas without actually having to run it. Showing and hiding some parts of information is a nice feature in mobile apps, especially considering that the iPhone screens are much smaller than those of laptops or desktop computers. Since iOS 14 in SwiftUI, we can collapse groups with disclosure groups. Now, to show you how to implement this, let's create a new SwiftUI file in the Views folder and just call it Demo View. Let's start by replacing this text view with a disclosure group. You can see that when you type, the code completion provides you with 6 different initializers, with the first one here being the simplest, yet least configurable. But let's start there. A disclosure group consists of a label to identify the contents and a control to show and hide the contents once it's been expanded. Showing the contents puts the disclosure group into an expanded state, and hiding them makes the disclosure group collapsed. In this simple initializer, we can provide a string for the label, like step 1, and for the content, we'll just provide a text view, like this is the first step in learning about disclosure groups. I want to add some padding to bring this in from the sides. If we enter preview mode, we see that by default the group is collapsed, and tapping either on the label or on the chevron on the right, you can toggle the collapsing or expansion of the content. Let's embed this now inside a VStack and push it up to the top by adding a spacer. This simple initializer is much the same as when we create a button. If we just want a string for the label, then we use that simple initializer. But if we want the label to be more complex and have more views, then we can use the alternative. So above the spacer, let's create a second disclosure group. But for the label, I'm going to use a label view. Now, don't get confused. The label is the second closure here. The label content can be any kind of view. It can be a VStack or an HStack. But I'm going to use a label. And I'm going to choose the label that uses a system image. For the string, I'll use step 2. And then for the system image, I'm going to use a lightbulb.fill. And then for the content of the disclosure group, I'll just use another text view that'll be very similar to the first one, but I'll just say that it's the second step. Now you'll notice as well that the 2 different initializers indent the content differently, so be aware of that. We can preview it, but it's not too exciting. So let's do some stylization. Let's start with that first one. I'm going to change the color of the label string and the chevron by applying an accent color of green. Now note it says that the accent color will be deprecated and we should use tint. And I'll come back to that in just a second. We see that by using the accent color, both the title and the chevron are green. Now if we do what the help suggests and change this to a tint, we see something different. Only the label view is tinted and not the chevron. And I believe that this is a bug, so I'm going to go back to the accent color for now. Let's add some padding. And then I'll add a background that's a rounded rectangle with a corner radius of 20. And then I'm going to apply a fill of a color green and then tone it down by setting an opacity of 0.1. That's looking pretty good. So let's do the same with the second one, but let's use orange as our color in both cases. Now by default, every time this view loads, both of these groups are collapsed. If we want to control that behavior, we can add an additional property to the disclosure group, and that's the isExpanded Boolean property, and it's a binding. So let's create two state properties for our disclosure groups that we can use. We'll call the first one step 1 expanded, and I'll initialize this one as true. And then for the second one, I'll call it step 2 expanded and initialize it as false. So we can now add our isExpanded properties to our two groups and bind them to their corresponding state properties. So in the first case, it's bound to step 1 is expanded, and the second disclosure group is bound to the step 2 expanded. Great, that's not looking too bad. Now, as these are properties of our view, we should be able to manipulate that state programmatically. So let's embed the content of both disclosure groups in a VStack with a trailing alignment. We'll do that to both. I'm going to add a button with a label of string next, and I'm going to leave the action empty for now. And let's do the same for the second disclosure content, but I'll change the button to say previous. Now what I want to do on that first disclosure group, when I tap the next button, I want it to collapse itself and automatically expand the second. And for the second, I want to do the reverse. So in the first case, we'll just set step 1 expanded to be false and step 2 expanded to be true, and then we'll reverse those for the previous button. Now if we check this in the canvas, we see that it's pretty jerky. So let's surround both toggles with an animation block. I'm still not that happy with that. What I'd like to do is to set a slight delay after toggling the first before toggling the second Boolean. Now, in the past, I would have used a dispatch queue.main.async after, but now we can take advantage of the new concurrency features of iOS 15, and we can embed the action in a unit of work known as a task. And then between the animations, I can call a task sleep function. Now this is an asynchronous function and it may throw. So I'll need to use try await and then call the task sleep function, and it requires a number of nanoseconds. Now a nanosecond is 1/billionth of a second. So if I want 1/4 of a second delay, it will be 250 millions of these nanoseconds. Let's try this out now. That's much nicer. Well, now that you understand disclosure groups, let's see how we can use that to our advantage. Let's take a look at that sample app that I provided. It's a simple list view that scrolls through a number of cities that are sorted by country. And that's why I call it the country list. Each of the items in the list displays the country flag and name, followed by the city name, and then the population of that city. Now, this information is populated from a JSON file that I've stored in the application bundle. And the JSON maps the two models that we have called city and country. Now, I use an extension to the bundle that I got from Paul Hudson's Hacking with Swift resources that will decode the data for me with a simple generic decode function. Now, if I were to retrieve this JSON from an API, I'd use an API service. Now, if you want to learn more about decoding JSON from a file, or from the bundle, or from a service, you can check out the series I have on decoding and parsing JSON. I'll leave a link in the notes below. You might also like this video and playground that I created that lets you do your testing before you build your app. In fact, I use that when preparing this video. Again, the link's in the description below. Now, I won't be using the service here, but I've left it here for your reference anyway. The country's list view model is where the work is done, and right now there's not much to it. It's an observable object with one published property, the cities, which is an array of city, and each city has a country object. And I use that bundle function to extract the array of cities and sort them using a tuple. This allows me to sort by country and then by city. Again, I have a reference video if you want to see how that's done. It's not relevant though to this video today. What I need to do is to get an array of unique countries that I can use for our disclosure groups. Now, I'm going to need this to be a published property because we'll be adding a new property to this to enable the expansion and collapsion of the groups. Let's call the array countries and initialize it as an empty array. Next, when we load in our cities and countries, I can extract all of the countries from the cities model using a map function because each city has a country property that's a country object. However, since there are many cities for each country, this will not be a unique set of countries. There will be many repeats. So you can convert countries to a set, and that's going to remove all duplicates, and then converting it back to an array. This is pretty simple, but that sort order is lost during the set conversion, so I'll need to sort this new unique countries array by comparing the name properties. Well, now that I have a unique set of countries that I've extracted from our array of cities, I can use this to create a dictionary using the country as the key, and then for the value, an array of all the cities for that country. So we can call this our countries dict. Now there's a very cool initializer for a dictionary where the key are groupings returned by a given closure, and whose values are arrays of the elements that returned each key. And this is exactly what I want. This is a dictionary where the values or grouping values are all the cities grouped by the city's country, which is the key. We can return to our countries list view now then and start making some changes to utilize this. First, let's change this for each loop to step through our array of countries instead. We're also going to have to change the iterator now to be a country. Now, since a for each loop can only work with an identifiable object, and our countries array is not identifiable, there is no ID property, we can use the name property for our ID. Now let me comment out this next block of code, but keep it here for reference and code the rest. We know that our dictionary has each one of these countries as a key. So we can create a disclosure group And for the label, we can display the country name and flag. So we can copy that HStack from here along with the font attribute, but we can remove the city. Now right away, if I refresh our canvas, we see that we have our collapsed state. Of course, when I expand, there's nothing to expand. What we want to do is display the list of corresponding cities. So for the content of our view, we can iterate over the country dicts value array, using that iterated country as the key for our dictionary. So for our city's content view then, we can then just copy what we used before and paste it in here and uncomment it. Now this is optional, so we'll need to provide an array if it fails. Let's just use an empty array, so no cities. If we check the preview now, we see we're there. We can expand and collapse our groups. So we can remove all that commented out code now. But I wanted to do more. I want to be able to have them all expanded when the view launches, and then be able to collapse or expand individual groups and have buttons that will expand or collapse all at once. Now the problem is that we need to have a bound Boolean property that will be unique to each disclosure group, and I have no idea how many groups there may be. And that disclosure group is a country object. So what I can do then is go back to our country and add a Boolean property that I'll call open. Now the problem is that we're decoding this from a JSON file, so we just can't add it. It's going to break our JSON decoding. We could add it as an optional property and that would work, but our binding needs to be non-optional. I need to have a value. Now we could run some function after loading that would set all of the initial values to true, but there's a better way. We can use custom coding keys that will do that for us when it decodes. Now if you're not familiar with coding keys, I'd like to point you again to that series on JSON decoding as I cover it there. We'll need to set up an enum of coding keys with an associated type of string and conforming to the coding key protocol. And then we specify a case representing each one of our three properties: name, flag, and open. And then what we do is we use the initializer from decoder. So first we create a container that will try to decode the container keyed by the type coding keys. So we'll use coding keys.self. Now we know that the name and flag properties are okay, so we can just let the container decode them both. So for name, we try to use the container's decode function for the type, which is string, so string.self, and that's keyed by the enum name. And flag is almost identical. We just need to change those properties to flag. It's the open property that's going to fail. So we'll set up a do catch block and we'll set open by trying to do the same thing as above. The type, however, is a bool and the enum case is open in this case. But we know it's going to fail. So what do we do if it fails? Well, we'll set it to our default, which is going to be true. That's it. Now you may be wondering what this hashable is all about. It turns out that I left this in by mistake when I created the starter project. You see, we need it to be hashable in order to create and display our lists based on that country's dict array. The difference is now that we have a Boolean property for our array of countries that I can use, but we want to be able to modify that property each time we want to toggle it. Well, in an iOS 15 list view, we can do that. Currently in the list, we iterate through the country, but as it is, we can't use that open property as the binding for our disclosure group because it's immutable. However, it's a published property, and we can change this all now to a binding. And then we can add the isExpanded property binding to the open property of our country. And since we made them all true when we decoded them, when this view appears, each of the disclosure groups are automatically expanded. Great. What I'd like to do now then is create a couple of buttons above this list view, still within the VStack, and we'll use one for expanding all and one for collapsing all. And then I'll create a function in my view model to handle the actions. So let's create an HStack. And for the first button in the HStack, I'll use a string expand all, and then use string interpolation to display a system image, and I'll use chevron.write. Let me copy and paste that in for our second button. For this one, I'll call collapse all, and then I'll use the chevron down instead. And let me lead it with a spacer to push it to the right. And add some padding. So let me return to my view model now and create that function that we can call. Let me call the first one expand. Well, we can use the countries.indices to grab the index and then iterate through each one of them using a for each loop. And then we can use that iterator as the index for the country, which is $0 in shorthand, and set the open property to true. Now, collapse all is going to be almost identical, except that we'll need this to be false. So let's just add a Boolean argument to this function, and we'll call it expand. And then we'll pass that in and change it for this property here. So it's either going to be expand all being true. For collapse, it'll be expand all with false. So let's return to our countries list view then and call the function with the correct Boolean value. We can see that now in the canvas that it's working as expected, except that there's a couple of things that are bugging me. When I collapse all, the button is still active and I keep trying to tap it again. And the expansion and collapsing, it's not really smooth. So to fix the smooth transition, I'm going to enclose both of these function calls within an animation block. That looks smoother, but I need to fix the buttons to disable this one if they're all expanded, and this one if they're all collapsed. So, returning to our view model, I'm going to create two computed properties, both being Booleans. And the first one I'm going to call all expanded. So I want it to return true if all of our disclosure groups are currently expanded. Well, this is perfect for the all satisfy function. So when I say countries.all satisfy, what I want to do is check every particular property to see if they're all the same. And I can use $0.open, and if they're all true, they'll all be satisfied and return true. If they're not all true, it's going to return false. All collapsed, my second computed property, is going to be almost exactly the same. It's just that we don't want to check to see if they're all open. We want to see if they're not open. Now, all I need to do is to apply this disabled modifier to each button whenever the corresponding case is true. So, back in our list view, this first button is going to be disabled when they're all expanded. And the second one is disabled when they're all collapsed. If I refresh the canvas, I see that they are all expanded and that Expand All button is disabled as expected. If I collapse just one, neither of the buttons are disabled. You can test out all the different combinations and you'll find that we're done. But let me just check it out on the simulator to see how it looks there. It looks great, I think. And even in dark mode. Well, I hope you learned something in this video that you can use in your own projects. If you did, make sure you give the video a thumbs up and leave me a comment and subscribe to my channel. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.